So this morning, I have a question for you. Have you ever experienced a time when God arrived? When heaven and earth met and they were one? When you could not deny that God was in that place? So could you point to a time and say, the Lord's Prayer was fulfilled in this moment right here, however fleeting that might have been? Have you ever had an experience like that when God arrived and the world was just different and it was hard to explain and you want to get back there again, but you can't force times like that. They just kind of happen. And there have been many times, I just came off of a week of camp, and it always reminds me, whenever I'm at a camp, it reminds me of camps that I attended when I was in high school, when I was growing up as a kid. I have so many amazing memories of times as a youth pastor at teen camps, just staying up till all hours of the night, talking belief and faith with students and helping them take those next steps and come to an understanding of who they are in Christ and what it means to have faith in Christ and the work that God is doing in their lives. And there have been so many moments, not just in the chapel service with the lights dimmed and the worship team going and the students just all around the altar pouring out their hearts to God, but also in the cafeteria in the middle of the day, on the beach, as some kids are swimming and the rest of us are talking about what does it mean to follow Christ? What does it mean to be baptized? What does it mean and just God broke in those moments, and I love them so much. Well, this morning we're going to turn our attention to 2 Samuel chapter 6. 2 Samuel chapter 6 is an account where heaven and earth met. It is a story of, well, it starts off a little bit dark, but it ends with nothing but good news. So if you would turn with me to 2 Samuel chapter 6, we're going to begin reading in verse 1, and we will finish reading in verse 19. We might skip a little bit in the middle, depends on how I feel. But the author of 2 Samuel writes this: David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. David and all the people with him set out and went from Baale, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim being the angels that are on the top of the ark. It was the mercy seat. It was the place where symbolically and in some sense literally God dwelled on earth amongst the people as they were traveling through Egypt, or from Egypt through the desert towards the promised land. They carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on a hill. Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went in front of the ark. David and all the house of Israel were dancing before the Lord with all their might, with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. It's amazing. The ark of God is coming to Jerusalem, the capital of the Israelite people. The Ark of the Covenant was the symbol of God's presence on earth. The Israelites would follow the ark through the desert. When the tabernacle was set up and the ark entered, the cloud of God's presence would descend upon it, and they knew that God was with them. You read through the book of Judges, you read through the Old Testament, and when the Israelites went to war, they would bring the ark with them, because if the ark was there, God was there. And that's why the Philistines wanted to capture the ark. They wanted to take the presence of God away from the Israelites and have the presence of God for themselves, which was ironic because when the Philistines who didn't worship God actually attained the ark, then rats and tumors overtook them, and they could not encounter the one true God without their disease and filth being exposed in very tangible ways. There's a whole nother sermon in that. But what we're going to focus on is this. in this first part, the Israelites made a mistake. They put the ark on a cart. That's not how the ark was supposed to be transported. They were transporting the ark how the Philistines transported the ark. They were trying to bring the presence of God to Jerusalem, but they were going about it the wrong way. And then what happens? Well, when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen shook. He was scared that the ark was going to fall, and so he tried to steady the ark. You weren't supposed to touch the ark. It's right there in the instructions on how to care for the ark. Don't touch it. Well, Uzzah, with good intentions, tried to save the ark, which is kind of funny because a mortal tried to save the presence of God by his own might. Again, there's a whole nother sermon in that. And what ended up happening is it says that the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him there because he reached out his hand to the ark, and he died there beside the ark of God. David was angry because the Lord had burst forth with an outburst against Uzzah. So that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. And they left the ark at the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months. They were scared to move it. They were like, if this is what happens when we move, if this is what happens when God's presence is among us, we've got to figure some stuff out first. And so they left the ark with Obed-Edom. In the 3 months that the ark was there, God blessed Obed-Edom and all of his household. And it was told to King David, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. David danced before the Lord with all his might. David was girded with a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the trumpet. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. They brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before the Lord. When David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts and distributed food among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, to each a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. Then all the people went back to their homes. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. See, and this second part, from verse 12 to 19, just for now, let's ignore verse 16. It's a bit of a downer. Here comes Michael Downer. Verses 12 through 19 that's what the world should look like when God's presence arrives. When God arrives, it is celebration, it's jubilation, it is amazing, and it's life-giving. See, one of the crazy things here is David was clothed in a linen ephod. Now, some people like to overplay this point. Some people talk about David dancing naked before the Lord. He wasn't naked. He was wearing a linen ephod. Some people say, oh, he was girded with a linen ephod. That means that he was wearing it like a diaper, and it was just kind of wrapped around his waist, and the rest of him was naked. No, he was girded with a linen ephod. That means that he was wearing it, and he had the belt tied around his waist. He was wearing the ephod. Well, then some people say, well, the ephod was short. He was wearing just a linen ephod. It was just kind of this tabard that went over. So he was naked underneath and just had a piece of cloth over him. So when he was dancing and jumping, then he was exposing himself. So, no, that's not what a linen ephod is. See, an ephod, there's 2 types of ephod talked about in scriptures. There's the high priest's ephod, which had the breastplate that had the 12 gemstones on it. Inside of this ephod, there was a pocket that contained the Urim and the Thummim, which, we don't really like to talk about the Urim and the Thummim because those were ways that the Israelites divined God's will. They were 2 stones that were painted black on one side and white on the other, And so when the high priest was trying to discern the will of God, he would take these two stones that were painted white on one side and black on the other, and he would ask God a question such as, God, do you want us to attack the Philistines in this city? And he would throw them into the air, like flipping two quarters, and they would land. And if they landed white, white, then God's answer was yes. If they landed black, black, then God's answer was no. If they landed black, white, then it was either wait, pray, and ask again later, or do what you think is best. I'll be with you either way. And so obviously we don't like talking about that because that's just leaving it up to chance, and you can't trust chance. But if you really trust God and are really sincerely praying for God, then do you think that God can control the way that the stones flipped? Now, I'm not saying that you should go out and flip two coins to ask if God wants you to buy the new Mercedes-Benz or not. That's not the message here. I'm just saying that there's this one type of ephod, which was the high priest's garment, that contained the elements of the high priest's role to symbolize to the people who the high priest was. And then there was the linen ephod. If you go earlier in 1 Samuel, when Samuel was working in the temple, it was talked about how he was a boy in a linen ephod. If you look at different points in Judges and in 2 Samuel and throughout the Old Testament, you will hear about different people wearing the linen ephod. The linen ephod was the cloth worn by the functionaries of the temple. The Levites who were serving in the temple would wear the linen ephod. It was a white garment. Why did they wear a white garment? It's because the pure whiteness was reflective of what happens when we encounter God. See, when Moses ascended the mountain and came face to face with God and he came back down, his face shone with the presence of God. Moses was glowing with the presence of God. In a day and age where they didn't have bleach as we know it, if you had a garment that was white, the person wearing it would appear to be glowing. That was the point of the ephod, was to represent the shining of the presence of God amongst the people. So when you entered into the temple or into the tabernacle, you were surrounded by people clothed in pure white linen clothing that represented the shining of the light from the Ark of the Covenant to the people. Another interesting side note is the ephod wasn't something that was uniquely Jewish. A linen ephod was something that would be worn by pagan priests as well in their gods' temples. But it was also used to cover the idols of these pagan gods. So it was a garment that was used to symbolize the set-apartness, the uniqueness. It was a covering for the priests and for the idol itself. And so David comes and he takes off his priestly garments and he puts on a linen ephod. And there's something fun in that when you think about the ephod being something that covers the idol statue of the temple. Because if you look at Genesis 1, well, look at Genesis 1 and 2, specifically Genesis 2. Genesis 2 describes the earth in terms that parallel the building of a temple, about the world around it, about a sacred place being built within the midst of the world, and then an idol is placed within the garden. You all know why we aren't supposed to, why within the Ten Commandments it says, you shall not make for yourself a graven image, right? We're not supposed to make statues of God. Do you know why we're not supposed to make statues of God? Because we are the statue of God. God placed humanity in the midst of the garden. He placed his own idol statue in the middle of the garden. We are God's image. Humanity is the image of God. And so when David takes the ephod and puts it on himself, he is covering the idol in the sacred garment. Now, that doesn't mean that we worship each other. Let's don't get too extreme here. but we are the image bearers of God. So it makes sense for us to be clothed in the radiance of the God whose image we bear. And so David, the king over all of Israel, rejects his place of high status and comes alongside the priestly caste and puts on the linen ephod so that he can participate in the sacrificial worship of God. And David danced, and he celebrated, and he sang, and he was exuberant, and he was in the midst of the crowd mingling, rubbing elbows with the most common person as the ark was brought into Jerusalem. And there's a little bit of ambiguity here. It says that David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And then when those who bore the ark of God had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. Did he start sacrificing oxes and fatlings at the house of Obed-Edom, and then like every 6 paces between Obed-Edom's house and Jerusalem, every 6 paces offer a sacrifice? Or did the sacrifices start when they got to the gates of Jerusalem, and it was every 6 paces and then an offering, and then every 6 paces then an offering as they got closer and closer to wherever the tent was set up within Jerusalem? There's not a definitive answer. But either way, that is an obscene amount of sacrifices. Could you imagine walking 6 steps and then stopping and waiting for an ox to be sacrificed and burnt, and a fatling to be sacrificed and burnt upon altars? Every 6 paces, an altar was built, animals were sacrificed. Not just 1, but 2 were sacrificed on the altar. Then you walk 6 more steps, and an altar is built, and animals are slain and sacrificed. 6 more steps, and then an animal is sacrificed, the altar is built. 6 more steps. 6 steps, stop. 6 steps, stop. 6, and then a rest. 6, and then a rest. I feel like I've encountered that cycle before somewhere. I can't put my finger on it. Oh, it's a Sabbath cycle. Purifying the city. 6 steps of work, and then we rest, and we celebrate, and we focus our attention on God. 6 more periods of work, and then we stop, and we focus on God. 6 steps, and then we focus on God. Celebration, sacrifice, acknowledgement that God is here among us, and the world is right, and everybody is celebrating together, thousands upon thousands joined in the streets and just having the best time. And at the end of this, again, they have sacrificed hundreds of animals, at least hundreds of animals by the time they get to the end of this procession. And what are they going to do with all of this meat? Because the offerings, the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being, if you look back in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the books of Moses, the law, the burnt offering and the offering of well-being, those offerings weren't completely consumed and burnt to a crisp on the altar. They were put onto the altar and they were cooked, and then the meat was distributed amongst the priests and the family who had come to offer the sacrifice. The purpose of a portion of it was consumed in fire to put up to God, but the rest of it, the balance of it, was given back to the person who had sacrificed it so that they could go and they could offer a feast for their family and friends. And what does David do with the rest, with these offerings? When the ark had come and rested in the tent where it was destined to be, then they distributed the food among all the people. The whole multitude of Israel, men and women, each got a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. When God arrives, when God's presence is here, when people are celebrating the presence of God, the needs are met. God's presence brings life, it brings wholeness, it brings completion, and it is good. But then we have this dark cloud hovering over the whole thing. Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. Michal, daughter of Saul. I always wonder, why was she in a bad mood here? What is wrong with her? The entire city is celebrating and exuberant, and she's up in the temple looking out in anger and bitterness. Now, this phrase where it says, Michal, daughter of Saul, might hint at the fact that maybe David and Michal's marriage was not in a good place. They may have already become estranged. And Michal was David's first wife. She was because this is what they did back in those days, she was a present from Saul to David when David was serving him. And it says back when they got married that Michal wanted to marry David because she loved him. When they first got married, they loved each other. And then there's a whole lot of complicatedness where Michal ended up being given to a different man by Saul to be his wife, and then David comes back and steals her back. So that might have started a bit of a rocky point where her first husband killed her second husband in order to take her back to be with him instead. It's like, well, I could see how that might put a strain on a relationship. But here, God's presence is coming to the capital. And instead of joining in the celebration, if David could don a linen ephod and be dancing and participating, there's no reason why his wife shouldn't have been there right next to him, dancing and celebrating as well. And yet she had isolated herself. A lot of commentaries mention that Michal put too much weight on the royal office, that she thought that the royals should be separate and should be more aloof. This is hinted at when we read verses 20 through 23. When David returned to bless his household, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants' maids, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover himself." And that's where people kind of get the idea, and they read into that he was naked because he uncovered himself in front of the maids. David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me in place of your father and all his household to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, that I danced before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abashed in my own eyes. But by the maids of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor." And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Michal was a little bit catty. That first highly ironic, sassy phrase, well, how the king of Israel honored himself. She's focused on his kingly role. The king took off his kingly garb and put on the lowly garb of a servant. I feel like that points to something else. We'll get back to that later. The king took off his kingly robes, threw his authority to the side, and subjected himself and made himself a servant to celebrate the arrival of God into Jerusalem. I wonder if part of her bitterness came from the fact that David was offering the sacrifices before the Lord. See, if you flip over to 1 Samuel, if you go to the 13th chapter of 1 Samuel, we read this account. In verse 8 of chapter 13, the author records, he being Saul, waited 7 days. Now the Philistines were coming up to fight against Israel. Israel's army had gathered and they were waiting to engage. And so Saul waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal. And the people began to slip away from Saul. So Saul said, "Bring the burnt offering here to me and the offerings of well-being." And he offered the burnt offering. As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to meet him and salute him. Samuel said, "What have you done?" Saul replied, "When I saw that the people were slipping away from me and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines were mustering at Michmash, I said, 'Now the Philistines will come down upon me at Gilgal, and I have not entreated the favor of the Lord.' So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. The Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him to be ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." And Samuel left and went on his way from Gilgal. The rest of the people followed Saul to join the army, and they went up from Gilgal toward Gibeah of Benjamin. Saul, when facing the Philistines, offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being in order to entreat the favor of the Lord in the battle. David, as the ark is brought back from exile into Jerusalem, offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before the Lord. Saul was rejected as king of Israel because he had offered sacrifices. David is celebrated, and it is a good thing that he offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being. Do you think it's possible that Michal, seeing what her husband was doing, was bitter because he was doing and being celebrated for doing the very things that had gotten her father rejected as king of Israel? She was bitter because she couldn't see past the act to the heart of the matter. Saul offered the sacrifices out of fear and out of impatience, doing what he thought was right, following his own way. David did this to honor God and to seek God and to humble himself. Saul was lifting himself up by placing himself, forcing himself into that situation. David was rejecting the role of king and assuming the role of priest. Not out of pride, but out of humility and out of worship. This person who stands outside the celebration, looking on in disdain and critiquing and negativity, reminds me of a story that Jesus told about a father who had two sons. The one son, the younger, went up to his father and said, in essence, because sometimes we lose this in translation, "I would be better off if you were dead. Give me what's mine." By asking for his inheritance while his father still lived, he basically said to his father, "I wish you were dead. So give me what belongs to me." So the father, being a loving father, sold off his property so that he could give the one portion of his property to his younger son. And the son went off to a far country, squandered everything, to the point where he had to get a job. The only job that he could get, because there was a famine, was slopping the pigs, which for a Jew was the worst job you could imagine. And then the son says to himself, "My father's servants eat better than this. I will go back. I will admit to him that I am a fool. I will beg him for a job in the lowliest of the servants of his house, and maybe he'll be gracious enough to welcome me." And so the father, as the son approaches, it says that the father saw him while he was still a long way off. And this father, and in that society, if you were important, you did not run. You didn't need to run. You had people who ran for you. Running was a sign of lowliness, of you were the servant that was going to get something for the important person. If you were the master of the house, you did not run anywhere because nothing started until you arrived. When you arrived was the time when you were supposed to arrive. It's like Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings. A wizard is never late, nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to. The master of the house is never late and is never early. the Father arrives, and when the Father arrives, that's when he's supposed to arrive. And yet the Father in the story is waiting and watching and looking for the Son, his eyes on the horizon, so that when he sees his Son, he rejects honor and he runs to greet the Son. And the Son tries to get out his spiel about how he is sorry and how he just wants to be a servant. And the Father's like, just stop. You are my Son and I love you. You were dead, now you're alive. You are part of this family. Here is a ring. Here is my robe. We are going to have a feast because you are back. And this is amazing. And so they go in and they slaughter the fatted calf. And they have this exuberant celebration. And in the midst of this amazing, epic, just block party celebration, the older son is outside and bitter and angry. It says, how could you celebrate him? He squandered your wealth. He sullied your name. He has rejected you. And yet you celebrate as if he's just the best thing ever. And yet I've been here working for you and slaving for you. And me and my friends have barely gotten a goat out of the deal. I says, do you not realize that everything here is yours? But he was dead. Your brother was dead and is now alive. How can we not celebrate that? So then the question for us is, what happens in our minds when we witness the presence of God arriving? When God arrives, what role do we fill? Because I'll admit, there are times when I am like David, when I am in the midst of the celebration and I am exuberant and I am celebrating and dancing and shouting and praising and I am caught up in the moment. But there have also been times when I am the older brother or Michael, like, yeah, they think they're celebrating God, but what are they really celebrating? Are they just caught up in the moment? This is just emotionalism. I've been on that side too. But if God is really there, if God has really arrived, how often do we block out the celebration that we could be a part of because we are standing back in judgment instead of allowing God to move how God wants to move? And yeah, maybe it doesn't look how I expect it to look, and maybe it comes in a way that I don't expect. But God's kingdom is breaking through. It's a good thing. This last week at the camp that I was at, the student worship time was in the mornings, and all of my messages, all the students kind of sat there. They were tuned in. There was a couple of them on their phones, but I mean, I've preached in sermons. I've preached at churches where the old gray hair people are scrolling through Facebook as well. So it's not a teen thing. But there was one day where I gave an altar call asking if they would want to come and pray, and nobody moved. It's like, oh, I've messed up. But then later, I hear from some of the adults that the students were going to them and asking questions about what I had talked about through the week. On a Thursday afternoon, one of the students asked to talk to me, and I went and I talked to them. And they come from a very rough situation. And they were talking to me about their home life, and just like they don't understand this whole God is love concept because they don't know what that means. So why would they, what does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to experience God's love? What does it look like to do this? They're like, I want to try out this God thing, this Christian thing, because I want my life to be better. And so it's like, well, what does it mean for your life to be better? Couldn't really put their finger on it. It's like, well, here's the promise of Christianity. And I spoke to them about the resurrection and about what it means to be, about what heaven is, about heaven being the place with no tears and no sadness and no sickness, where there isn't any form of abuse, whether it be physical, mental, emotional, drugs, or whatnot. There isn't abusiveness because everything is good and everything is whole and everything's how it should be. In this conversation, the student was extremely guarded leading up to this point. But when I started talking about what heaven is, the student, just the biggest smile broke out on their face. They're like, I want that. Good. Follow Christ. Accept God. Allow God to work in you, and you will get this. And not only you will get this when you die eventually and after the resurrection happens, but we catch glimpses of it here and now. When we catch those glimpses, that smile on the student's face was a glimpse of heaven and earth joining together. How good is that? So the question that I want to leave you with is this. Where, like with Saul or with the cart, did you try to force God to show up? Or where do you try to force God to show up? How do you try to force God to show up in your life? And do you need to retake stock of how you interact with God? And let God come how He decides, in His way and in His timing. Where is God showing up in your life and the lives of those around you? Can you recognize the glimpses of the light of God breaking through in the lives of the people you work with who are not Christians, who have not yet come to a saving knowledge and saving relationship with Christ? Can you see those glimpses of the light breaking through the cracks? And can you validate those? And can you celebrate those in a way that will drive a deeper wedge into the darkness and break it through? How do you respond when God shows up? May we be like David, and maybe when it's appropriate, doff decorum, throw it off, reject what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to look, and humbly assume the role of the servant so that we can celebrate along with everyone else as God arrives. Let us pray. Father God, I thank you that you are breaking through, that you have not abandoned your people. But I'm thankful that you are here in this place this morning with us, and that you are also outside of these walls, that you are actively at work in people who are still asleep in bed and have no inclination to go to church, that you are at work in those who have been up for hours and hours preparing their hearts for worship. Thankful that you are in the countries around the world who have already worshiped you this morning, that we are simply the tail end of a day dedicated to the worship of you. So Lord God, I pray this morning that you would help us to take our cues from you, our Father, who runs to welcome home those who have rejected and dirtied and sullied your name through irresponsible living. That we would join alongside David in offering sacrifices of praise and of well-being. And that as your presence arrives, that our world would be healed, that the needs of every person would be met through the sacrifices that are offered to you. Lord God, make us the vehicle of your presence, that we would be able to love and please you with every moment of our days. Help us to identify those points in our lives where we have been more like the older brother or like Michael, where we have looked with suspicion upon your work. God, help us honor you with our thoughts, words, and deeds, that your kingdom would come and that your will would be done on earth as it is in heaven. We thank you and we praise you this morning for your presence in and among us. We pray for all of this in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen and amen. Go now to love and serve our Lord. Amen.